20.5 million people lost their job in April, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That brings the United States unemployment rate to 14.7%, the worst since the Great Depression.
But White House Coronavirus Economic Task Force member economist Stephen Moore did share some optimism with radio host John Catsimatidis on Sunday. He believes that after a tough summer, there will be a swift kind of recovery for the fall. Stephen is also the author of Trumponomics and a distinguished visiting fellow at the Institute for Economic Freedom, and he joins us now via Skype. Nice to see you, Stephen.
Hi, great to be with you guys.
Good to see you.
So we've seen, unprecedented job loss. Even those number 14.7% unemployment likely understates the case. What gives you hope that we could see that kind of economic rebound quickly?
Well, first of all, you're right. The unemployment numbers are actually much worse than that headline number because they weren't counting millions and millions of workers who have been furloughed or workers who are getting paid but not on the job. And so we're probably closer to a 20% unemployment rate right now. And it could easily climb to 25%, which would match the highest rate that we even saw during the Great Depression. But I also think that this is a short-lived crisis. I think the summer is going to be brutally bad. It's going to be really bad in terms of businesses just trying to get their feet back on the ground. They'll be very slow to hiring workers back. But I do think by the end of the summer, early fall, we'll start to see a recovery. And once that recovery begins, I do think we could see a really good fourth quarter. Larry Kudlow, my buddy who's over at the White House, is saying pretty much the same thing, that it'll be about the fourth quarter of 2020 and then the first quarter of 2021 when we start to see a rebound. But a lot of this depends on whether these states get open now. We still have half of the states that are shut down: New York and California, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Michigan. And if those states stay closed down for another 4 or 6 weeks, then all bets are off about whether we see a recovery in 2020.
So, Stephen, that's why I wanted to have you on. You've been one of the chief voices for reopening the economy, and yet we have seen in terms of movement data that regardless of lockdown, in terms of people's phones and the way we can track that, regardless of lockdown, people are not moving. And that even in countries like Sweden, Sweden's own central bank, which never had a lockdown, is still projecting that they're going to have the worst economy in all of Scandinavia. Yeah. Why is it that you seem to think that lockdowns are a political problem and not an economic, or are a political problem that can be essentially turned off and not one simply as a result of the virus and consumer fear?
Well, I'm not disagreeing with you. There's no question about it. Americans are afraid. I was looking at some polling yesterday. Still, half of Americans are very nervous about going back on the job or even going out of their house. And so I'm certainly attentive to that. I don't believe, by the way, that anybody should ever be forced to leave their house if they don't want to. I have good friends who are very deathly afraid of the virus and they don't want to take any risks. But I've noticed just in the last week where I live in the Washington, D.C. area, people were out en masse this weekend, much, much more so than in past weeks. So people are starting to get out. It's going to be a slow process. You're absolutely right. And I think for the next couple of months, that's why the summer is going to be so bad. You're going to have a lot of businesses trying to regain customers. You're going to have a lot of Americans who are not going to feel comfortable about going into a store or going into a restaurant or a bar or any kind of sporting event. And so it's going to be a slow process. I think my point is we better get this process started, because every week that we delay this process of getting back to some degree of normalcy is the carnage. The damage that we're doing to our society is so severe, heartbreaking to see, millions of businesses fail, so many people suffering from isolation. We're seeing huge increases in people dying from things from drug abuse to suicide you're seeing huge increases in the number of cases of spousal abuse, child abuse. We can't keep the American economy locked down for another couple of months without really, really damaging results.
So, Stephen, I think we both agree with you about the effects of a lockdown. However, one of the things I've noticed is that you and other proponents of reopening are doing this in lieu of a proponent of a large fiscal economic response. Can you explain why that is? Because does not seem to be a explanation from the pro-open the economy folks about how we're ever going to reach the aggregate level of spending that we're going to need. And it looks like, to me and to some, in lieu of trying to advocate for a large fiscal response, that we're just moving instead towards pivoting to reopening the economy? Help us square that circle.
Well, remember, let's start with the most important premise. Government spending does not stimulate the economy. I get so frustrated when I hear people talk about the stimulus bills. I mean, those bills don't stimulate anything, right? Because the government can only spend $1 if it takes $1 from someone else. So there's no stimulus effect from government spending. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't have passed those aid bills. Those were aid bills to help people who are struggling. But on aggregate, it doesn't help the economy grow. We should have learned that, for example, in 2009, remember when President Obama passed that massive $1 trillion spending bill that had almost no impact on the economy whatsoever. So what I advocate is a massive a bill that would have a really very positive impacts on the economy, which is to suspend the payroll tax for the rest of the year. That would give a 7.5% pay raise for every single American worker. A 7.5%, even the minimum wage workers would get a 7.5% pay raise. That would be a great thing to do for the American worker. And then for the American companies, the small businesses, we have 28 million small businesses in this country. They are the spinal cord of the American economy. They are so struggling. You would reduce their payroll costs by 7.5%. That would inspire them to hire more workers. So let's do things that actually help employment. What we've done so far in those spending bills, in fact, I'd make the case they've had a negative effect on the economy. I mean, look at the unemployment insurance. I talk to businessmen and women every day who say they can't get workers back on the job now, not because they're afraid of coronavirus, because they're being paid more in 31 states to stay unemployed than to get back on the job. Now, come on, how stupid is that? I mean, you can't possibly come up with a dumber idea than to pay people to stay unemployed and to pay them more than to go back on the job.
Stephen, with all due respect, I think the least of the problem here is that some people on unemployment insurance are getting a little bit of extra money. I mean, how does a payroll tax cut help the 33 million workers who are unemployed, not on any payroll? And I also want to hear your thoughts on the approach to small business. I mean, you call them the spinal cord of America. Why did they get so much less than the $4 trillion concierge loan program for the big guys? 40% of small business owners told the Chamber of Commerce they may close their doors permanently in the next 6 months. I mean, how do you defend that approach?
Yeah, so for the first one, I mean, I think you answered your own question. The way you help workers is to get them jobs, not to pay them not to have jobs. And so the payroll tax cut increases employment by giving incentives for people to go work, and it gives employers a huge incentive by reducing the cost of hiring a new worker. So the best thing you can do for an unemployed worker is give them a job. And I think almost all economists agree that a payroll tax cut will get people out of unemployment into jobs. So that would be a very, very pro-worker thing to do. And also, I just think American workers deserve a pay raise, and they would get a 7.5% increase. You would, I would, the minimum wage worker would, working class people would,
but you can't possibly think that all of the unemployment, the 33 million unemployed Americans, is just because there was some incentive in the unemployment. I mean, that seems crazy to me. So what about those people who are still unemployed? What about a $2,000 check, as has been proposed, some kind of UBI to help people through this time? It seems the fundamental thing is. Let me just finish the thought, and then let me get your response. I mean, what you're fundamentally proposing here is a false choice between stay locked down and suffer economically because we've had a fully inadequate response, which you seem to agree with, or let's just reopen and magically everything will go back to normal. What about staying closed for safety's sake, as we still have thousands of deaths, and actually having an adequate federal government response to help people through the crisis?
Well, because if we keep our economy locked down for another couple of months, we're going to destroy the economic base of our country. We are going to have devastation. We're going to have not 30, but 50 million. How many unemployed people are you willing to have? 50, 60, 80 million people unemployed? At some point, it doesn't matter how many of these aid programs you pass out of Washington. We're going to run out of food. We're going to run out of items. In the grocery stores now, you're even seeing meat shortages. It's going to get a lot worse if we don't start producing things. If you don't have production, you don't have an economy. It's that simple.
I don't think there's any disagreement here.
That makes the point. The single most important thing we have to do is get the economy opened again, because all of these problems are being cascading at such a rate that it will cause untold human misery if we don't do this. The
But
death
Stephen-
rate. I mean,
Stephen-
let me just give you a
Yeah, go
statistic.
ahead.
There's a rule of thumb that for every 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, that's associated with about 10,000 additional deaths. So if we take our unemployment rate to 3.5% to 23.5%, which we could easily do, you're talking about 200,000 additional Americans who will die as a result of that. I mean, how is that a humane policy?
Right, I don't think anybody is defending that. But let's pick up on something that you said, talking about meat shortages. Meat shortages are now a national industry. It's not for a lack of keeping the economy open. All of these plants are open. It's that workers do not feel safe going to work and are quitting en masse, and also do not find the wages and personal protective equipment. So reopening is not simply the magic bullet, as you're proposing, is that at the end of the day, like if people feel like they're going to get sick when they go to work or go to eat, they're not going to spend any money. So that's what I'm saying is that, just by advocating reopening as a magic bullet is not going to make up the 100. I mean, you're essentially what it would be is maybe around a 75% economy, even in a reopening scenario. So in that scenario, doesn't a large fiscal response merit? And what you're talking about is payroll tax cut. And I know you've advocated for tax cuts your entire career in life. And one of the things that we saw with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is it didn't necessarily spur investment. It's very much out of the bag on whether these companies actually invested in their workforce or in the capital infrastructure that they needed in order for material goods rather than things like stock buybacks. So how is it that would be the approach at this time, just to reopen and then cut taxes? Seems like something that you would have been proposing for decades now, irregardless of this pandemic.
So, look, I agree with your fundamental point is right, that we have to make Americans feel safe to get back on the job. There's no question. You and I are in a whole agreement about that. We have half of the economy that's opened right now, right? I mean, I had an interview a week or two ago with Fred Smith of FedEx. He has 350,000 employees. 350,000 employees that are working right now on the job. Those are truck drivers, they're mechanics, they're pilots, they're delivery people. And out of 350,000 people that he has in employment, you know how many have gotten sick? 500. 1 out of 1,000. People are more likely to get sick by staying at home than working for Fred Smith at FedEx. My point is, we can do this. We can get Americans back to work and do it in a safe way that keeps people healthy, because we see companies like Amazon doing it. We see companies like FedEx doing it. You're the ones who are setting up a false choice that somehow we have to let 40 or 50 million people lose their jobs, lose their livelihoods, go into Salvation Army truck lines so they can get dinner at night, or else we, let 20,000 people die. No, that's not the choice. We have to be very smart about doing the reopening of the economy so we get goods and services so that families have food, and we have goods and services that go to the families that are working. And we do it in a way that's safe, with testing, with screening, with social distancing, with gloves, with masks. I'm all in favor of those kinds of things. Now, come on, you're going to argue that our tax bill didn't work? We had in February of 2020, before coronavirus hit, we had the best economy in 50 years. We had 7 million surplus jobs. We had a 3.5% unemployment rate. We had wages rising across the country. The economy was growing at 3.5%. It was the most beautiful picture you've ever seen. How in the world can you say that the policies didn't work?
I was talking specifically about business investment. Talking specifically about business investment there.
Better trade deals. And Trump's best line is, look, I know how to rebuild the economy. I did it when I took over from Obama, and I can do it again. And look, I'm an optimist. I do think we can rebuild this American economy, but it's not through massive government spending. That never worked. It didn't work for Obama. It hasn't worked now. We have to get back to the policies that do work, reward hiring, reward our small businesses. And I agree with you, by the way, it is an abomination, the fact that the loan money did not go to the companies that deserved it. It went to big corporate America. I think that is an outrage.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining us, your perspective. We appreciate it. And we'll have you back as this continues. So thank you very much. We appreciate it so much.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Take care.
See you later. Next on Rising, Georgia Senator David Perdue. He left his board seat at Cardlytics to become a United States Senator, but not without some money. And The Intercept's D.C. Bureau Chief Ryan Grim, he's going to explain that more.